In the town of Laon, in the eastern fields of France, where it's cattle country, we have a place that hasn't gotten much bigger since the 13th century when they erected their cathedral. Laon had been the capital of Carolingian France until Hugh Capet, who preferred Paris, moved it in 987. Still a place of little alleys, higgledy-piggledy, what the English would call snickleways. Peter Abelard, the great scholastic philosopher, began his study. They still have a little street here named after him. When you come around Rue Pierre Abelard, something stunning happens. Emerge onto the square where the great 13th century edifice was constructed, adorned with cows at the apex of the pillars. Money from which industry had financed the great cathedral.
After the success of the little abbey church of Saint Denis, retooled into the French style, being just north of Paris, all the builders working on the great cathedral building campaigns in the Paris basin at some point traveled through, heard about this church, went to go see it, and began to replicate the technique on larger and larger scales in the towns where they were working. Notre Dame in Paris was begun around 1160, and about a decade later, the cathedral at Laon was begun. Laon is one of the few major towns of medieval France that was not built on a river, which made transport in and out much easier. It was out in the, this is where the medieval cowboys were. This was cattle country. And Laon, the town, is built up on a hill on a promontory, and so its cathedral can be seen from 20 miles away, its towers beckoning travelers as they approach the town. When I first saw Laon back in 1994, this is the photograph I took. And it is indeed rather gray and grim looking. It seems to match that modern pop culture understanding of Gothic. But again, that's just because it hadn't been cleaned yet. The French government has been busy cleaning their cathedrals since the 1990s. And once cleaned, they are magnificent. I finally returned to Laon in 2008. And here is that cathedral right after the scaffolding was taken down after the cleaning of this west facade. It's an extraordinary difference. Returning it to the original color of the limestone, it brightly shines. It's a beacon as the sunlight hits it. So I went to Laon to see this, but what came next was a surprise. This picture was taken in the middle of the afternoon. Later in the day, I came back for a cappuccino and a beer, and as I'm taking a look at this cathedral, the stone begins to glow this color. This rosy tinted hue begins to emerge as the lowering sun hits it at a different angle. So these two pictures were taken on the same day, about 5 hours apart. So this is something of the miracle of what this limestone does. All the tiny little mineral deposits that accumulated, which are slightly different in different regions of France, will have different effects on the color quality of the building. Talking to a bartender there who knew his town history, he said that back in the Middle Ages, when pilgrims began to arrive from a distance, they thought that the towers were on fire, the way they were glowing in the sun. And that may well be the case. I returned to Laon in 2011, and it was late in the summer, so the sun is at a slightly different angle, and the atmospheric conditions were slightly different, and this is how the cathedral appeared. What a difference a cleaning makes, huh? The interior of Laon, tall, elegant, refined. This is what the Gothic builders were after, a soaring monument to their piety and to their abilities. This is looking up to the central box tower of Laon Cathedral. You can see how light and graceful the masonry is becoming as their skills increase. Villa d'Arnacourt visited Laon and drew a picture of this tower elevation. This is the northwest tower. So there is the actual tower on the right, Villa is drawing on the left. So you can see that he rendered a couple of the cowls that are distinctive to this tower. Villars tells us that he's been in many lands, but he's never seen towers like those at Laon. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us why these towers are so impressive to them, just that they were. So it's hard to say. Laon towers are unusual in that they avoid being overly boxy looking by having smaller porches extending at the 45-degree angles from the corners of the main structure. And as you look at Villars' drawing and compare them to the reality, with a little practice, your eye begins to figure out how Villars, living 250 years before linear perspective would come to Europe, how he took his image and tried to flatten out and draw and make clear the most distinctive features. So these corner towers are here. There's the cowls above them. There's the apex of the tower. There's also this interesting hand that Villars drew, and that hand would have been right there where there's a little gap in the stones. Architectural historians have climbed all over this tower and scoured documents trying to find out what happened to this hand, what he might have depicted, but we have no evidence. We don't know what happened to it. It's a Gothic mystery. This may well have been a bronze or some kind of metal fitting that had extended from here, representing the hand of God. It's hard to say exactly. It may also be that Villars was referring to how these towers look from a distance, particularly when you're looking at them from a 45-degree angle from the main axis. When you look at them at this angle, the openings in the porticos and the tower structure allows light to flood through. It makes the entire thing look kind of lacy and diaphanous. It's almost impossible that all of these tons of stone could rise up against gravity and reach the sky the way. The town of Laon also had a cathedral school, and it was famous for studying natural philosophy, what we would call science today, or what passed for science in the Middle Ages. And a lot of this had to do with the study of the natural world through bestiaries. So bestiaries were these fanciful medieval manuscripts full of delightful images of animals and plants, both near and far away, domestic and exotic, all based on the ancient Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, who was not very critical when he heard stories and wrote them down. He simply recorded every wild and fascinating story he ever heard. So it's from medieval bestiaries that Pliny's knowledge of the natural world survives, and it's where medieval people learned things like crushed rhinoceros horn makes a good aphrodisiac, and the medicinal qualities and magical qualities of plants and various animal parts. In any case, the fascination with the study of the natural world led to these extremely unique gargoyles that we have here. If you look closely, you'll see this hippogoyle and rhinogoyle emerging from the side here, doing its standard gargoyle function, but also reflecting something distinctive about the town. And that's worth noting that while all these Gothic cathedrals are built using the same techniques and skills, no two Gothic cathedrals look alike. Each one is unique, hundreds of them, and all of them are unique and tailored to the town to reflect the town's personality. On my third trip to Laon, I finally got the chance to climb one of the towers and see it from the inside, and also look across from the south tower to the north tower and get a side view where you can see the difference between the cleaned and uncleaned portions of the tower. So that's what about 800 years of soot and grime and pollution and neglect do to the limestone, and how it appears after a proper cleaning. It took them about a decade actually just to clean that west facade. They'll probably be cleaning on this and all of these cathedrals pretty much forever to keep them in shape. Next, we go to an even larger cathedral at Reims. Reims is a royal town. The town itself is owned by the King of France. It's where he keeps his oriflamme and his other royal paraphernalia at the cathedral there. Reims is where Joan of Arc identified the true Dauphin. Reims has many famous stories linked to the Middle Ages surrounding it. I always seem to have bad weather when I go to Reims, especially when I'm going there to photograph. So here it is when I arrived, and it's going through a foggy, misty rainstorm here. Although I should not complain, Reims has seen worse days than this. Here's a colorized postcard from Reims during World War I, when an incendiary bomb went through the roof and burned the entire thing down. So the recent fire at Notre Dame in Paris is not a unique event. The World Wars and the French Revolution were particularly hard on a number of these cathedrals. At Reims, since they had to reconstruct it right after World War I in this emerging age of modernism, they went for a steel roof that is completely fireproof today. When I first saw Reims back in '94, this was the photograph I took of it. They were just beginning the restoration. You see the scaffolding just going up, and the cathedral, beautiful and elegant, but a bit grimy and dirty. When I returned in 2008, they had nearly completed it. The scaffolding was just coming down off the last bit, and it had been completely restored. Notice also the cars that are parked around it, because they dealt with that problem of car exhaust and the pollution that it dumps into limestone as well. Behold Reims as it appears today. Magnificent. So this is the golden limestone that many of these cathedrals were built of. It's why they're depicted gold colored when you see them in medieval manuscripts. And the town planners wisely made this a pedestrian and bicycle zone so that we no more auto exhaust dumping soot into the stone. And look how far medieval builders have come in about 150 years. On the left is the Cathedral at Caen, built in the High Romanesque period, a very impressive building for its time. On the right, the west facade of Reims, about 150 years later. And look at the intricacy, the complexity that these sculptors and masons have achieved in building these ornate cathedrals. There's simply no comparison. Laon, of course, spent a lot of time at Reims. The largest collection of drawings from any particular church are from this one, including these flying buttresses, which he drew, which do not exactly match the reality, which has led to much of the debate about Villars' professional training and leads many to reject the idea that he himself could have been an architect or a master mason who actually knew how to do monumental stone construction like this. It is more likely that he was perhaps a subcontractor, a carpenter, engineer, an artisan, carver, craftsman, something along those lines. But he does draw a very handsome profile of these buttresses, and as it is likely that he was merely gathering ideas for client presentation when he got back to his hometown, this would have served the purpose to give them an idea of the kind of things that they might incorporate into the building that they were planning. Also at Reims, we begin to see an extraordinary leap into naturalism. Returning again to the Romanesque images on these pilgrimage churches, which are seen once in a lifetime by worried about his sins and Judgment Day, we again are reminded how frightening and purposely scary these images were, as Christ is throwing the sinners on his left-hand side who have failed to pass the Judgment Day scale test into the jaws of hell. Our Romanesque carvers were getting pretty skilled at rendering human emotions. Look at the terrified look on the faces of the people as they see what's awaiting for them. Being yanked by demons and dragged off to an infernal end. It's quite a contrast at Reims, where instead of all this terrifying judgment of Christ, we see angels smiling at the worshipers as they enter the church. The smiling angel stands right outside the front door, down at ground level. There's one on either side of the building where the entrances are, and she makes eye contact with you. She smiles at you. She welcomes you into church. This is that Gothic era new piety. The idea that religion is more than just about a bunch of rules and hierarchy and knowing your place and doing rituals, but that the experience of Christianity should be emotionally fulfilling. It should be a riveting and enriching experience. And we see in the High Middle Ages the emergence of artwork that catered to this newfound need of the emerging medieval middle class to have an emotional experience of their religion. Christ begins to hang and suffer on the cross. Mary and Jesus begin to look at each other tenderly in a family values kind of approach to very traditional and old-fashioned subject matter. It was the method of rendering them that had changed. And so now we have warm, smiling, emotionally fulfilling images of the religious biblical figures. You might also notice a bit of polychromy, a bit of paint here on the wings of the angel and some dim chevrons on the background. It's because all these churches were painted and colorful originally, a topic to which we shall return at the end of these lectures. Also, again, notice in the background the very lively, very realistic naturalism in the leaves and the berries that have been carved in the decorations. Clearly, these artists are going out into the woods, looking at the real world of nature, looking at God's creation and rendering it faithfully in their art. Just compare the typical Romanesque foliage on a column capital to what we see here at Reims. We go from a repetition of mathematical, geometrical stylization to true observational naturalism. These green men that adorn several cathedrals also show this fascination with the natural world. Some think this might be kind of a dim pagan leftover, Jack Sprite, the spirit of the woods, that is still finding its way through popular peasant level cult belief to the sides of the cathedral decorations. Here's looking at the nave of the upper clerestory windows at Reims. Many of the windows were destroyed in the fire in World War I. So when they went to rebuild them, you have to remember that unlike today, as they consider how to redo Notre Dame in Paris, they're planning on going back to a faithful restoration of what it was before. In the early 20th century, it was a new age. World War I had kind of shattered all the old illusions of what society and civilization was. The old standbys had fallen away and a brave new world was emerging. And so the town planners decided that rather than trying to replicate the lost medieval windows, that they would go full throttle modernism with it. So they hired an artist named Marc Chagall. You might know him from this painting. That's his most famous one called Eye in the Village. And they hired Chagall to design modern art style stained glass windows. So the result is that at Reims, when you go into these choir, you see Chagall's dreamy, kind of early surrealistic style windows, the modern and the medieval coming together in this great church. Moving south now to the town of Albi. As I said, every Gothic cathedral is unique, but none of them are as bizarre as this strange amalgam of both cathedral and medieval castle. The reason is that in the south of France, there was in the 12th and early 13th century a heretical movement in the eyes of the church called the Cathars. And it's hard to know exactly what the Cathars believed. We only have the words of their enemies to attest to them. The church claimed that they were a revival of Gnostic dualistic heretics that had been supposedly squashed back in the days of the Roman Christian world. It's hard to know exactly what they were. They essentially thought that the Pope was a big dummy and you ought not to obey him, and priests don't really have the power to wash away your sins and send you on the way to heaven, that really just being good was up to you and you could have a more direct relationship with your religion. Protestant Reformation ideas several centuries before Martin Luther. In any case, the Cathars, also called Albigensians, because Albi was one of the towns they were centered at, had for a while taken over the town and driven the bishop from his cathedral. And this was not going to be taken lightly. For one thing, Albi is a very, very wealthy town. This is the center of the blue dye industry in the Middle Ages. There's a tiny plant called woad that is cultivated and grows wild in the area, from which you make this very, very exquisite blue dye that was much sought after for coloring garments. It's the basic same thing that you see in blue jeans today. So when the bishop retook his town, the cathedral that was in the midst of being built, he decided to change course and structure it so that he could use it as a castle and fight from it should he have to fight these heretics again and defend his town. So you'll notice here a cathedral that is also a review of elements of castle design, which we've discussed earlier. Here you'll see what had been planned to be large, spacious stained glass windows are now bricked up and only narrow arrow slits are left behind there in case you've got to fire at the enemy from them. You'll also notice that the roof is flat in case you need to put armed men on top and use it as you would from the top of a castle. There was only one entrance, not the traditional three, in this cathedral. And in the Middle Ages, there would have been walls around here to force you to turn left in order to get to the entrance, as all well-built castles force you to do. From another angle, we can see that the base of this flares out and is extremely sturdy. There is no way that trebuchet fire is ever going to take these walls down. And see missing here that you're used to seeing in cathedrals by now are flying buttresses. It does have buttresses, but they are inside the walls. The outer walls are extended to surround the buttresses that hold up the cathedral, because if you ever wanted to knock down a Gothic cathedral, not that you would ever want to do that, but if you wanted to, all you have to do is undermine a couple of the buttresses and the whole wall is going to collapse on you. So moving the buttresses essentially inside the walls prevents that from happening. Now, because we don't have giant windows flooding the interior with light, rather than having the stained glass effect on the inside, the interior of Albi is simply painted with fascinating ornamental designs. Many of it is post-medieval geometrical play that you can tell is not medieval, but there is still, against the back wall, this huge mural of Judgment Day. And so here we have all the good people resurrected on Judgment Day that are going to heaven to join the choir of angels. But here on Christ's left side are the damned who, because of their adherence to false teachings, are being now condemned to hell, where they will suffer eternal torment. And I'm sure the bishop just relished in delight as he imagined all those enemies of his that dared to defy his authority, suffering for eternity, gnashing and gnawing their teeth as the flames devour them for eternity. Good stuff. Moving on. We go to one of the most famous of all Gothic cathedrals, the Cathedral of Chartres. Chartres is about an hour train ride from Paris. It's easy to get to, and if you're going to see one other cathedral in France other than Notre Dame in Paris, you need to go see this one. Chartres is not the biggest cathedral. It's not the splashiest, the most ornate by any means. The towers don't match. They were built 150 years apart and styles had changed. And when they built the second one, they were running out of money, so they just got it done quickly. But there's something about Chartres that is just special. Hard to say exactly what it is. Part of it is still the Romanesque in the lower registers down here. Chartres had been a Romanesque cathedral and a very popular pilgrimage destination since Carolingian times, because they have a very special relic there, the veil of the Virgin Mary. It is the veil that she wore supposedly when she gave birth to Christ. And unlike the Shroud of Turin, which has been carbon dated to the High Middle Ages and is an obvious forgery, this veil is actually first century silk. It has a better argument to being authentic than a lot of the other relics in Europe. Obviously, many of them are fake. I mean, there are 3 different skeletons of John the Baptist that were touring Europe at the same time. Apparently, he had 3 different heads. But here we have a building and a relic that has been drawing pilgrims for a long time. On June 11th, 1194, a bolt of lightning struck one of the towers and burned most of the cathedral to the ground. The relic barely escaped. A monk ran in and dashed out with it and saved it. And the townspeople took this as a sign that the Virgin Mary would like to have her church rebuilt in this fabulous new Gothic style that had become all the rage. Give her a proper French-style church. And that's what they did. The real reason that Chartres is such an important cathedral today is just that it's been lucky. Chartres has the best surviving collection of original medieval stained glass windows in France. As we've said, the World Wars and the French Revolution had been unkind to these cathedrals, and glass is a very fragile material. Chartres has been lucky. It has evaded riots. The World Wars missed it. There was a bomb in World War II, I believe, that took off the very tip of one of the towers, but just barely missed the church. So almost all of its 168 windows, almost all of them are still the originals. And so people come from all over the world to study authentic medieval stained glass. It's a workshop there. You can learn how to make stained glass, and you can train in the skills to do stained glass repair for churches all around the world that require it. But there's also something else. You just have to go to this church to really experience it. It's something about the balance of the glass to the stone, the huge amount of blue that you see in the glass. The Virgin Mary's signature color is blue. You always see her in art with a blue veil on. So they spent a lot of money making blue glass, which is extremely expensive. and surrounded this whole church with basically a symbolic expression of the special veil that brought tourists there. So go to Chartres, bask in it. It has been newly cleaned. It will not be the same experience I first had, and we'll return to that theme in just a moment. But there you're going to see glass as the medieval people originally experienced it. Christ and the devil, good and evil, and all the stories of the Bible depicted in the original shimmering luminosity that the designers had conceived. And there you can see depicted in glass, not just Bible stories, but also elements of people's everyday life. The works of different months of the year are depicted, the signs of the zodiac. Here is a monk sneaking himself a little drink off the keg there. And because all the townspeople contributed to the cathedral, it was a matter of town pride to build a fabulous church. All the different guilds and professional organizations contributed money, and they paid for each of the lancet windows. So each of the windows is known as the window of the winemakers, and that's a detail of this window here. And whatever the profession was that had the guild that provided the money, they depicted their work in the very bottom register near ground level so that you know who had paid for the window. So here's the very, very bottom slice of the lancet window that was paid for by the Guild of the Carpenters. And as a fan of medieval carpentry, I particularly like this one. And here you can see medieval carpenters building scaffolding for working here, using various carpenters' adzes and augers to shape wood. You can see a nice frame saw hanging in the background there. And here we have specialized medieval carpentry, wheelwrights and coopers, making wagon wheels and barrels. And so here you can see medieval people as they were depicted by their contemporaries in the glass. And here is the single most famous stained glass lancet window of all Gothic architecture, La Belle Verrière, or the Mary of the Beautiful Glass. When you go to Chartres, as you're walking around, you'll notice that all the windows are dominated by this kind of cobalt blue color, as you also see around the edges here. But when you get to Mary's window, you're going to find that Mary, who's one of the largest figures, 3 frames tall, depicted in any of the windows, has a garment on that is this rare sky blue color. And these windows are actually from the old Romanesque church, which miraculously had survived the fire. And so her image here, surrounded by cobalt blue, but her veiled in sky blue, just pops out from everything else. Your eye keeps being drawn to it, no matter where you're walking around in the church. And so the light from God shines down through Mary's veil, through her glass, and bathes all the worshipers in her light. And it's also a very important method of crowd control. When you're there looking at this window, turn around and you'll find that there's a little door that goes underneath the altar. And that goes down into the crypt where the relic, her veil, was originally kept. Now it's back in one of the side chapels. But this would have allowed peasants who may well have been illiterate to know where to find it. They couldn't read a sign saying veil this way, but Mary here shines her light and guides them to the thing that they came to see. The Virgin Mary made lots of miraculous appearances. In the High Middle Ages, we have many chronicle accounts of Mary showing up and saving someone from disaster or inspiring them. She appears to St. Francis and tells him to save her church. And she, according to tradition, had her veil had saved the monk that had run in to get her relic out of there. And apparently she still makes miraculous appearances. If you want to see Mary in beautiful glass, you need go no further than Clearwater, Florida. Residents of Florida may remember back in the 90s, a famous event in which a bank building in Clearwater had all of its exterior windows cleaned. And suddenly this image appears. The faithful see Mary miraculously showing up in these windows. Eventually, they couldn't continue conducting business here, and they sold it to a religious organization, and it became itself a pilgrimage destination. So there is your Mary of the Beautiful Glass. At this point, we should note that Gothic architecture is not only the final climactic epitome of all traditional stone architecture, meaning the biggest, most complex thing you can build out of stone. Traditional architecture can get no bigger than this. And nothing surpasses Gothic in the centuries that follow. Nothing built in the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Enlightenment gets any larger or grander than the Gothic cathedrals. They just change the style and go back to making things look like classical Greco-Roman buildings. The size of the Gothic cathedral is not surpassed until we get to glass and steel skyscrapers of the modern world. And these Gothic cathedrals are sort of its inspiration. One of the early pioneers of the modern skyscraper was Frank Lloyd Wright, who grew up with images of Gothic cathedrals in his room that his mother put there to inspire him. And he always loved Gothic architecture, took inspiration from it. And so architects who study architectural history took their cue from this. A Gothic cathedral is essentially a giant stone skeleton wrapped in glass. When you look at a modern skyscraper, they're not building an 80-story wall up in the sky and putting a roof on it. They're building a steel skeleton, which they then wrap in glass. So the steel I-beam welded structure carries the weight of gravity and the wind shears and allows you to wrap your skyscraper in glass so that everybody can have a nice view out their office. Gothic cathedrals are stone skeletal structures that carry the weight and resist the wind shears and are wrapped in colorful glass. A modern skyscraper is a monument to power, wealth, and industry. And they're analogs of medieval cathedrals, which are themselves monuments to power, wealth, and piety. So there you go. The Virgin Mary making her appearance in the great achievements of both medieval and modern architecture.